You are listening to the podcast Sigdrifa. I present another esoteric audio today. The title is The Two Swords of Parzival. It is about the mystical death and resurrection of the Hyperborean soul, based on deep and interesting conversations between Miguel Serrano and Carl Gustav Jung. Enjoy! We are gardeners in the dark. The astral body must be created. The image of our immortal soul is an inexistent flower. Some call it the secret golden flower. This flower exists but cannot be seen. Eternity is found here. All this may seem unreal, but it is more real than what actually exists. I will in this podcast try to explore and bring to light the commonality and differences of how poet and philosopher Miguel Serrano and Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung looked upon phenomena such as the absolute self and the astral body and the archetypes, Unus Mundus, or as Jung coined it, the collective unconsciousness, and much more. Miguel Serrano and Carl Jung, they visited several times in his home in Zurich in Switzerland. They exchanged deep esoteric knowledge and continued their lifelong friendship through correspondence. Carl Jung, he wrote the prologue in some of Miguel Serrano's books. And Serrano, he writes about their encounter. He says like this: "On my return to the West, in that European world which is not like the South American one, I discovered that a noble white spirit had left Europe forever. In Switzerland, beside a lake, in a tower built by his own hands, and whose construction had been determined by his dreams, I met Carl Jung. He was carving a serpent on a rock, while the waters of the lake lapped gently around his feet. He saw me arrive, exhausted, thirsty, and hungry, and he invited me inside the tower to rest beside the fire while he prepared a meal for me. Like you," Jung said to Serrano, "I have lost the war, and when I have left this life, a conspiracy will take place against me. It has always been so, because only poets will be able to understand me and continue my work. Sometimes I think that my fellow countrymen in this tiny land in which I'm living in this turn of the wheel, that they hate me because I endanger their materialistic, money-oriented way of life. I am not from this world. I am a Hyperborean like you, Serrano. I am a stranger in this world, in this land inhabited by the slaves of Atlantis. We lost this stage of the war of the Mahabharata. And because of this, my work will remain unfinished, and only poets, as I've said, will be able to understand it and carry it on. This homeland of mine, which was once Druidic, has remained a part of a Celtic confederation whose symbol is a clover with 4 leaves, because it lacks the 5th leaf, which is the Hyperborean polar spirit, the leaf of the number of destiny. It lost it. It will never have it back. At least your homeland, Jung said to Serrano, is the land of the morning star. Serrano looked at Jung and said, "Why didn't you risk your all? You were also a son of your mountainous country, lacking in sacred fury." Jung replied, "I would have lost the little I had salvaged in the battle, and now it will be the sons of my own flesh who will take part in the destruction of my work." He pondered and said, "Oh, a creator, a warrior, they should never have children." "Oh, that is true," Serrano agreed. Jung poured them some wine, and he put some large pots and the old metal frying pan into the cupboard. He greeted the pots and thanked them, talking to them as if they could understand him. And after an almost religious silence, with a sharp look at Serrano, he said, "Well, pilgrim, you have eaten and drunk. Do you wish to rest, or would you rather open your heart to me now, as you did long ago when you were a king standing beside the swings?" "I will talk to you now," Serrano replied. "That's why I have come. Only you can answer me, Jung." Serrano was reminded of a correspondence the two of them had had about the subject of Selbst, and he asked Carl Jung, "Have you met someone who has been transmuted, changing the center of their consciousness and reaching the self, or Selbst as it's called in German, thanks to a special technique?" "Personally," Miguel continued, "I have my doubts. I do not believe it is possible. It seems to me some distinct beings are born with this ability. Perhaps the effort made today in our lineage bears fruit in the future, in someone to come, but who has not yet arrived, the man to come." "I've been asking myself this question," Serrano says, "my entire life without obtaining the answer. Is there any reason to believe that anything survives death? The ego, for example, can it die? If the ego dies, everything comes to an end with it." Serrano was reminded that one day Jung explained to him that if the ego didn't exist, there would be no world. If a yogi, for example, had stripped himself of his ego in his profoundest state of samadhi, there would be no one there to know that he had been in samadhi. Or perhaps he didn't even know he was in samadhi himself. Samadhi is a state of meditative trance. So there is individuality without ego consciousness, Serrano continued. Because Maestro Eckhart, he said, a stone is a stone because it has no ego consciousness. And without consciousness, without ego, there can be no individuation. There is then a persona, but no personality. There is simply no possible way out of my ego. A moment of sigh, a nothing, the disappearance and resurrection of the world, the sleep, the repose of the gods, the eternal return. It could well be a projection of myself or a splitting of myself in two. Words that I'm saying to myself, questions and answers that I'm putting to myself. A monologue in front of a mirror in which I'm looking at myself. Let's be reminded that at the end of Nietzsche's dramatic life, he also had discovered this. And he became all people in one at the same time, succeeding in escaping from the circle into madness. But did he really escape? So tell me, Jung, I have come here to consult you, to talk to you, and to talk with you about this. Carl Jung passed his old hands across his forehead and said, This has been my obsessive melody as well. The anguish of this mental brick wall, this narrow path which seems to leave us without a way out, without an answer. Because truly, there is none, There is none. The only thing I can confirm to you is that I, too, feel myself to be me. That's a poor answer, right? The way does not lie in reunification or resignation of the ego, or even crucifixion of the ego. A stable ego provides us with a necessary foundation from which to do our transformational work as individuals, Jung continued. In terms of alchemy, we can look at our egos as an aspect of the vessel in which the work of transformation takes place. The answer is in its supreme affirmation, rather combining the ego with the persona, which exists before the ego and which felt itself to be so old, so ancient, so filled with dignity. It's about combining them, the ego and the ancient persona, into the absolute personality. Serrano asked Jung, "Tell me, what is the ego? Where was it before it entered a child's body?" And Jung answered with another question. Perhaps it was the guardian angel, which the child later loses when the ego enters his body. Or perhaps the guardian angel is this wise man who goes away and when the ego enters the child's body and then returns. This is individuation, giving a face to the self, to the guardian angel, the monad, making the creator conscious. And do you know where I found the concept of the self that I used in order to allude to this mystery? I found it in the greatest psychologist of all time. We have already mentioned his name, Nietzsche, your wounded king. He was the first to discover it using the German word Selbst. Serrano asked Jung, "Please describe what is Selbst for you?" And Jung answered, "It's an island of glass, lost in the middle of the ocean, a city hidden in the depths of a mountain, an oasis of warm water in the mist of the eyes. It is a continent of the golden age, a castle surrounded by flames in which the beloved lies asleep. Yes, because once there was a king, a queen, a sleeping beauty in the wood, an eternal love. Only poets will be able to understand me." Serrano gave up a sigh and he agreed, yes, only poets will be able to understand this. I would like to add that there are other definitions by Jung on self. In his last book, Red Book, that was allowed to be published 2009, he argued that the soul possessed qualities that were complementary to the persona. Jung wrote, "A very feminine woman has a masculine soul, and a very masculine man has a feminine soul. The more masculine his outer attitude is, the more feminine his traits appear in the unconscious." Jung designated the man's feminine soul and he called it the anima, and the woman's masculine soul to be animus. And he described how individuals projected their soul images onto members of the opposite sex. Let's take a closer look at Miguel Serrano's thoughts about The Escape from the Eternal Return, where he takes the concept of Selbst a bit further than Carl Jung, and where he explains the exit of the mystical death, and that there is an exit. Serrano writes, "There lies a gate through which one, by combining the ego with the self, can enter, leave, and return through a portal. The escape from the eternal return can be found neither above nor below in any absolute sense, but only in the center of the circle, as a mandala teaches us. Creation starts and ends in the middle, underneath the polar star. And the swirling of the leftward swastika, that of return, is what brings us to encounter this escape. And with this, individuality is changing and moving from the rational consciousness closer to the ocean of the unconsciousness, without ceasing to be conscious, but with a different type of consciousness, bringing light as far as possible into the darkness. As progress is made on this difficult path, the ego begins to become conscious of Selbst and of the astral body. The ego is making the astral body visible and thereby expanding the ego by aspiring to become the absolute self. This is when the mythical death takes place, and the mythical death is the conscious detachment of the rational conscious ego. Then, and only then, the absolute self with a super consciousness is united to the self and Selbst. Furthermore, Serrano adds, there is a lingering, rotating, luminous light that increases in strength as we stay observant to the rotation of the chakras, giving energy to the formation of the ultimate inexistent flower. This flower is the symbol of finding our soul, finding our Selbst. And the body of our soul must be created. Selbst, or self, is the astral body, Serrano claims. And Serrano talked about tantric alchemy of the Hyperborean science. There is an ancient science, a Hyperborean technology, making possible the return of the Vîra to his divine origin, lost in a combat or unknown situation. This is something only Vîras can achieve, since only they have potential astral bodies, because in Hyperborea they were astral bodies in their origin. The claimed alchemical mutation is of a Vîra into a diva, into a divine being that is reached through the resurrection of the astral body, the Son of Man. This science is preserved thanks to the ancestral Aryan blood memory, still being unbroken, and the blood memory is also called the golden band or the golden cord. And the awakening of the blood memory, minne, is a physical experience. And when the blood is activated into remembrance, the ancestral awareness comes alive and one falls into deep nostalgia. The way of this science is retrograde, backwards, leftwards, rotating towards the polar origin in the symbol of the most ancient time wheel that there is, the swastika. So, as the astral body is giving birth to the Son of Man, the total man and the total woman, its blood is transferred from the physical body to the astral body. This is called the awakening of the blood memory. And once created and materialized, the astral body, also called vril, will regenerate and resurrect the physical body, changing form as well. And the astral body can now seemingly disappear, transforming itself into a sword called the Sword of Parzival. In essence, transforming itself into two swords, the physical body and the astral body, like in the Aryan Taoist yoga of the most ancient China. So, about the battle, at the time of the fulfillment of the two swords, representing the physical and the astral, which is also called the mental body, all the battles unleashed against the enemy are carried out simultaneously in the two worlds, with two swords. The latter, the astral, best destroys the enemy, and the Nordic polar race is resurrected. Therefore, when the battle happens that way, then we will see the earth regenerates as well, putting an end to the Kali Yuga and eventually recovering the Golden Age. This is high esoteric knowledge. This tantric alchemy of the Hyperborean science, it was rediscovered by Odin during 9 nights of terror on the Yggdrasil tree. And furthermore, one can apply the exact rune to produce the mutation of the Vîra into a diva, into an immortal Siddha, and this sign of the rune opens simultaneously the passage back towards the original home of the Hyperboreans. This is the resurrected science of the runes, thereby fulfilling a dream not dreamed even by the most ancient pilgrims of dawn. Well, that was some dense, high esoteric knowledge about the mystical death and resurrection, going back to our Hyperborean homeland, given by the great poet Don Miguel Serrano. There were differences between Serrano and Carl Jung in regards to the archetypes, in regards to ascension, the Soror Mysticus, and so forth. I don't know if you have the strength to go on a bit further, but I would like to speak about some differences. Serrano, he writes that Carl Jung did not recognize the astral body. It seems like he ignored that. He did not recognize the astral body and the Selbst to be the one and the same. Rather, Carl Jung, he made references to Christianism, telling Serrano that Christus with a K was the Selbst, and he showed him his Gnostic ring and pointed out the transformation that he had done to the symbol to Christianize it, when he rejoiced also with the proclamation of the ascension of the Virgin by the Catholic dogma, understanding that Christus now have his feminine counterpart, accompanied by her, just like the ancient gods. So that was sort of like a tantric initiation, where the woman, the feminine eternal, has a fundamental role in the deification of the man, because she is the initiate. She is the alchemist, the Sorrow Mystica, the Amisa Uxor, the Yogini, and the Valkyrie. And Serrano further writes that in this civilization's most critical hour, in order to walk through these complex territories using concepts and terms only comprehensible by a minority, it is imperative to make use of the language contributed by Jung, the only one who has come close to the essence. Yet, Serrano says, unable to take the final step, only for his profession as a psychologist and also being a Protestant as Origen and his messianic connections. Nevertheless, Jung did speak about the archetypes, even if he never precisely stated what he understood about them. He referred to them more as a coding of the instincts. And at the end of his days, in the prologue, Jung wrote in Serrano's book, The Visits of the Queen of Sheba, that the archetypes are not mere products of the unconscious individual. He likened them to be autonomous gods. This indicates in a way that the same way as one looks at the pagan gods of iniquity. And as the gods never die, but are reborn and reincarnated, they will return with different robes and repeat the same story, and new religions would come up from the depth of the collective unconsciousness. And the gods are there to help the fallen man to recover his divinity and to show him his way back to his homeland. In the 1960s, as mentioned before, Jung wrote the prologue to one of Serrano's books, where he explains what he considers is the unconscious, or also called Unus Mundus. He writes, "The unconscious is surely the parameter, the mother of all being, the matrix, the background and the foundation of all the phenomena we call physical, religion, science, philosophy, and art. It is the Unus Mundus." Goethe said that the eternal feminine leads us to heaven, and Serrano expanded on this even further because he said that the impulse that drives you to fulfill the ultimate mystery, which is called the individuation, projecting the ego into the persona, into the monad, into the self, giving a face to the gods, lightening the darkness of the Creator, is none other than love. It is love that drives you in this endeavor. And Serrano, he gives it a name, this kind of love. He calls it amor, which means without death in Spanish. Serrano continued and said, "Only love can make you cross the deep chasm, the drawbridge that separates your ego from the castle in which your beloved lies asleep, jumping into the abyss. It is an effect, a change, a miracle. It is a non-existent flower, the self. Fall into this flower, and you will find the face of your beloved there." In conclusion, Carl Gustav Jung, he coined the term individuation process, where one looks upon oneself in a balanced fashion and sees the light side and the dark shadow side of self, and the lifelong work of integrating these two opposite polar sides of oneself is the individuation process. Yet, Christianity have a dualistic approach to these two sides of self rather than recognize them as polar entities. Serrano wrote that even though life is an affair of light and the shadow, we never accept it as such. We are always reaching towards the light and the high peaks, and the shadow side of real life is ignored, and Western Christianity provides us with nothing which can be used to interpret it. Thus, the young men of the West are unable to deal with a mixture of light and shadow, of which life really consists. They have no way of linking the facts of existence to their preconceived notions of absolutes. The link connecting life with universal symbols are therefore broken, and disintegration sets in. And at the end of Miguel Serrano's life, he concluded his thoughts about his dear friend Carl Gustav Jung. And he wrote like this: I know what Jung meant for me for almost all my life. Even now I quote him repeatedly. In my book, The Hermetic Circle, which has had such resonance, having been translated and edited into Japanese, Persian, and Greek, I published my conversations with him and with Hermann Hesse. Moreover, Jung prefaced my book, The Visit of the Queen of Sheba, where he can say I must have written it for him. He had never before written a foreword to a purely poetic and literary work, having limited himself to books like the I Ching and the Book of the Dead from Tibet, and a few others like those. In the prologue to my book, he makes revealing statements about himself, the archetypes, and the unconscious. Serrano claims that Jung considered himself to be a Hyperborean with all that comes with that when they first met, but the statement of Jung in an interview published after the defeat of Germany was of such magnitude that the admiration and veneration that Serrano had harbored for him for a lifetime crumbled in one blow. Jung charged Germany with a collective karma, claiming the folk of Germany being incapable of making individual decisions. He said the Germans embodied a demonic and a criminal collective soul. Germany is the eternal adolescent who must be controlled by sane adults, Jung said, and they shall forever carry a universal guilt. And Germany also must be Catholic, he added. Serrano writes, I could forgive and overlook the weakness of my friend Carl Jung, but not the bad conscience, the diabolical cunning used against an entire people and a beloved race, a nation in disgrace, physically beaten, inert. And Nicolas Palacio, who was a brilliant thinker, said, the people of race can only hear the voice in the magic reunion in the community of their blood. And Serrano was reminded of Nietzsche. He knew this well when he said, the most evolved races are the weakest, because they do not lie, nor believe that others lie. They are stupid like the eagle, he said, since they attack head on. The poet Miguel Serrano believed in magic, and he stated at the end of his life a very profound statement. He said, the total destruction of the civilization of the man who thinks with his head is only a matter of time. a magic type of man has appeared. The rationalist man will depart. This is the true revolution, the true change. And the new generation will think with a golden center of consciousness and understand each other without words. And only through such spiritualized and transfigured outlook can the earth be saved. Otherwise, catastrophe is sure to come. And after all these years of hard searching and great effort, I have come to understand that it does not matter where I am, Serrano says, because the journey is inside. For it does not matter how alone one is, nor how remote and distant, because if the right work is done, unknown friends will come to your aid. As the alchemist said, if you think the right thoughts, even if you are alone sitting in your room, you will be heard from 1,000 leagues away. And finally, I will read a poem by Miguel Serrano about the divine feminine that leads the warrior back to his homeland. She was holding a small book of poems. In her musical voice, she began to read. O blind traveler, beloved warrior, pilgrim of immortality, the secret of our road, spelled backwards, is our dog. My bonds are cut, my debts paid, my door has been opened, I go everywhere. They crouch in their corner and weave their web of pale hours. They count their coins, sitting in the dust, and call me back. But my sword is forged, my armor is put on, my horse is eager to run. I shall win my kingdom. You have been listening to the podcast Vîra. I hope that you enjoyed this Esoterica with the title The Two Swords of Parzival, the mystical death and resurrection of the Hyperborean Soul, based on deep and interesting conversations between poet Miguel Serrano and psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung.